I've been thinking a lot recently about the word sin and what that means. Now, I'm not religious, I don't belong to any religious faith. I would consider myself an atheist, I guess. So the word sin has a slightly different resonance for me, I think, than it does for religious people. And I'm trying to understand what that difference is. Because certainly when I hear the word sin, I never use it myself, but when I hear it, I can feel myself translating it into the terms that I understand. And I do think something's lost in that translation, which is preventing me from understanding it properly. So I'm just going to try and get under the bonnet of that a wee bit. When I hear the word sin, I translate it into, it's a two-stage translation. The first thing is that I translate it into a word that means something like immoral, an immoral act. If someone does something that's sinful, I hear that as saying, oh, they've done something that's immoral. So far, so good. But then the second stage of my translation is, well, what is immoral? How do I understand the word immoral? What is the framework, the structure, the organisation of my understanding of a word like immoral? And I think it's to do with a couple of things. I think it's partly to do with a kind of consequentialist ethics. You know, an act is immoral if it causes harm to someone else or some other being or the planet or something like that. If there's harm caused by an act, then it's immoral. Yeah, that's standard consequentialist ethics, which I think most people have. And then alongside that is a kind of desire for fairness, so reciprocity is at work there. If I see an act as immoral, if it's unfair, if there isn't a kind of payback, if there isn't a balance, if there's some cheating going on, or if something is stolen and not repaid in kind, or if the same wouldn't apply in reverse, it's just if inequality there. If it's, you know, these are all associated with balance, aren't they? And fairness, reciprocity. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, that kind of thing. Yeah. So I can feel that playing itself out in my understanding of what an immoral act is. So when I hear sin, I also have that kind of translation going on. So my understanding of sin, when I hear it, is to do with those things. Either it's an immoral act, and it's an immoral act either because it has bad consequences for someone or something, or because it's part of an unfair, unequal transaction. But that's not, I think, this is where I'm going wrong, I think. And because I think when people use the word sin, they don't quite mean that, or they add some other things to that mix. And I think the thing that's mostly added to that mix is to do with spiritual health, kind of. And that's a spiritual health which is achieved by a moral principle that's sometimes referred to as purity. And here I'm drawing on a guy who writes on these things called Jonathan Haidt, who writes about metaphors of, or models of moral thought. And he says that some people have this moral principle which is to do with purity. Some people don't. Everybody has the ones that I've already said. Everybody, Christians, atheists, Muslims, Hindus, you name it. Everyone's got those moral principles, pretty much, that I've already described. Everyone understands the idea of consequentialist ethics. Everyone understands the idea of fairness. They might not always abide by them, but they understand them. But not everyone has this purity thing going on. And purity is ultimately a morality based not on those kind of physical metaphors of cause and effect, consequence, nor on those physical metaphors to do with balance, like fairness, reciprocity, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Purity is a different metaphor entirely, and it draws on contamination metaphors. Something is impure because it's contaminated. And if it's contaminated, then it's harmful. It's harmful to the person who has that impurity inside them, but it's potentially harmful to others who come into contact with that person. So it's almost as if there's a kind of purity, contamination, disease narrative being played through this. A person who is sinful, in addition to perhaps doing things which are immoral and have bad consequences, or in addition to doing things which are immoral because they're unfair, may also be doing things which are felt to be kind of spiritually unhealthy. They're impure, they're contaminated, they have kind of spiritual dis-ease, spiritual contamination which causes spiritual ill health. And that ill health may be bad for that person, but it may also be bad for a wider society almost. It can be it can be contagious. Bad spiritual health can spread throughout a community, throughout a population, throughout a kind of body, a kind of spirit body almost. Given that it's a spiritual ill health, the spirit of the community might be damaged by that contamination and by that contagion, or maybe even larger spirits. Remember, we are talking about a kind of metaphorical, spiritual kind of metaphor here, in which the spiritual ill health wouldn't just reside in the body; it might reside through an entire environment. So the environment becomes contaminated. I think one of the things that's interesting about this, and this comes from Jonathan Haidt, he says that as I've already said, these moral principles to do with consequence, these moral principles to do with reciprocity, whilst those are universal pretty much, there's only a subset of people who have this purity metaphor, and it isn't exclusively religious people, by the way. There's only a subset of that. Religious people who have that purity are usually also politically on the right, and this is something that Jonathan Haidt finds. He says people who are either politically on the right tend to also have this purity metaphor, this metaphor of contagion as being a key aspect of what constitutes moral health, moral spiritual health. And if you are contaminated by that, then certain things flow from that. Whereas people who are not religiously and politically of the right tend to either not have that purity metaphor or have it in a different form. So I think when we are arguing with people who are saying we're sinful, it doesn't work simply to translate that into consequentialist ethics or something like it, or the ethics of reciprocity. You have to think of it, I think, that they're using a metaphor of disease based on contamination of something that is otherwise pure, and that purity is a spiritual purity, contamination of which leads to spiritual health, not just of oneself, but down the road to the spiritual health of community, nation, cosmos, almost. And the way people talk about this, and this is the kind of confirmation for that for me, the way people talk about it is in terms of cure, that the cure for spiritual ill health is accepting certain principles. You have to stop doing the things. It isn't enough that you stop doing the things that cause the ill health, which it would be if it was a moral, if it was simply consequentialist or reciprocity. You just stop doing the thing that's unfair, you stop doing the thing that's hurting people. Within this kind of purity thing, there's also a need for the acceptance. You accept Jesus Christ as your Saviour, or you accept other kinds of religious principles, which serves almost as a kind of nostrum, as an inoculation, as a cure for that spiritual ill health. It isn't enough just to not do the activity under that, because of the way that metaphor works. You have to accept the medication. But I mean, it is the play of metaphor. I'm not arguing for its truth. I'm not saying it's a lie either. I'm just saying that's the way that metaphor is playing out. So to me, it becomes more understandable and coherent if I think of that kind of the word sin as representing a compromised spiritual health.